Primera Corporation has provided the following data concerning last month's manufacturing operations. And at the end of it, we're going to prepare a schedule of cost of goods manufactured for the month and a schedule of goods sold for the month. So before we begin, we'll just quickly review a little bit about what we've discussed in this chapter. So a manufacturing facility has sort of a pipeline or a process. Here at the entrance, we can call this the entrance, we get our raw materials. So they come in raw. This would be like for a t-shirt manufacturer, you call this cotton and thread. For a sawmill, it would be lumber and trees. And we get a raw materials inventory. So this comes in, now this has value, and so it's going to be on our balance sheet. So as we receive it, it goes up, and when it moves along the process, it'll be down. So this would be a debit, of course, and this would be a credit. And the way it moves along the process is that it's requisitioned for to be manufactured. So again, if it were cotton, it would go into be making shirts. So a requisition would come for a portion of this to move over here. So then it goes into our work in process. Now, some, like a vehicle manufacturer or other manufacturer, or a ship manufacturer, or something large and complicated, it could be work in process for years, and it would span over different periods. Other items would be a lot quicker, and this work in process would be a lot lower of a budget. But still, this work in process is an asset as well that needs to be on our balance sheet. So a debit would make it go up, and so as we start works in process, we would reduce our raw material and create work in process. And of course a credit would make it go down. So we need to have a balance for work in process as well. As it is finished, it goes into our finished goods in inventory. And now it's no longer in process, it's finished. It's still another thing that we need to track. It's an asset, but it will need to be, again, separate from our work in process. So it moves along, again, it's an asset. Debit makes it go up, credit makes it go down. And only when it's sold and it goes out to the customer, do we convert it into our cost of goods sold. So when we do our schedule of cost of goods manufactured, essentially from this side of it, we'd have a schedule of cost of goods manufactured, and on this side we'd have our schedule of our cost of goods sold. And that's how we're going to be doing it. Now, a couple of things to note. We're going to, our work in process. We know that from earlier in the chapter, as we determine our work in process, there's going to be three costs to our manufacturing. We're going to have our direct material, which will come from our raw materials. We'll have our direct labor, which will be directly applied. And then we're going to have our overhead. Now, overhead will be applied. So we're going to set that up within our applied amount. And we assume that all of our, any indirect materials, this will include any indirect labor and any indirect materials. We'll go into this overhead that's been applied. Now, one other thing to remember as we do this, and something that will help you on your exams, and remember, the best way to kind of find out where we're at with all of these is we have our opening balance, we have our purchases, so in this case our raw material opening balance, our raw material purchases for that period. And that would get us our total available amount. Now everything, not all of this will get moved along to work in process. So whatever we have as our ending inventory will remain. This will leave the balance in the balance sheet correct to the count of the ending inventory. And then we're going to end up with our, whatever's used or what has flowed through. So used in production in this case. Materials used. So again, this will be sort of the same process we follow several times throughout here to get these schedules. So now we'll actually begin on the schedule with a little bit of context. So we'll start with the cost of goods manufactured. So this is Primaire Corp. It is going to be the cost of goods manufactured schedule of cost of goods manufactured, and I believe it said it was for last month. So there's no date, so we'll just write last month. Now again, there are three areas, three costs involved. So we're going to start with our raw materials, and our raw materials are what our direct materials are. So remember, we have direct materials, direct labor, and overhead. So we're going to start with our direct materials. And to determine our direct materials, we can determine how much raw materials we used. So to do that, we need our beginning balance. And that amount is 12,000. We're going to add to it our purchase. And we purchased 30,000. That will bring us to our total raw material available, which is 42,000. And then we're going to want to reduce what was left over, which, as you can see here, was 18,000, because that's what's going to remain on the balance sheet. The rest of it is going to continue along here in this cost of goods manufactured. So less ending balance raw materials. And we get our raw materials used in production. Of 24,000. Now there's one more thing we need to do. We need to less our indirect materials included in manufacturing overhead, which in this case is 5,000 indirect. Now why do we need to do that? Because as we discussed earlier, indirect materials will go directly to, any indirect materials will be applied to the manufacturing overhead. But we're already later in this schedule of cost of goods manufactured going to include the overhead manufactured. So if we include the raw material cost that was put to manufacture, and we do it again, the overhead, which we've already applied, in our journal entries, when we have indirect material and indirect labor, it goes to our overhead manufacturing, our manufacturing overhead, pardon me. So if we didn't remove this amount, it would be counted twice, because we're going to include the cost of the manufacturing overhead here shortly. So we have to remove this amount, otherwise it would be accounted for twice. Because some direct raw materials are used as indirect materials. So it's just the indirect ones that would be counted twice. So we're going to remove that. And now we get a direct materials total of 19,000. Now that's just direct materials. Now we need to determine our direct labor. Which I can see here is just 85,000. Now we can add our manufacturing overhead applied to our work in process, which, as you can see here, is 87,000. Which brings us to a total of just trying to find the number. If not, I can pull up my calculator. $191? Thanks. Which is a total of 191,000. Thank you. That total is our total manufacturing costs. But, as I mentioned before, this is just the part that brings us through to the pipeline from our raw materials to the work in process. This is the work that we did in this period. But in this work in process, we had a beginning balance to start and an ending balance to end. So we need to determine, we need to add our beginning balance that we go into the period with, our beginning balance of work in process, which was 6,000. And we need to deduct our ending balance of our work in process, which was 65,000. And we get a total of 132,000. Cost of goods manufactured. Now we can start on the cost of goods, the schedule of cost of goods sold. we need to, again, follow the same method. We're going to now look at our finished goods inventory. So we have our beginning finished goods inventory, which was 35,000. We can add our cost of goods manufactured, which is right here, because that would have all moved through the pipeline. And that gets us our cost of goods available for sale of 167,000. We can then deduct our ending balance of our finished goods, which is 42,000. So we have 42,000 left over in our finished goods. That means that we moved along out the door our unadjusted cost of goods sold balance of 125,000. Now, this, we need one more item. We need to add our underapplied overhead. Now, underapplied means we add it back, because if we underapply overhead, like we learned in the last example, that means we didn't include, our estimate was lower than we thought what our actual ended up being. So if our estimate is lower than what we actually thought, that means that we need to make an adjustment and our profit will go down because our costs were actually higher. Now this part, this add or less, is always going to be an adjusting entry at the end of the period. So this isn't going to actually change anything physical. It just means up here, when we did our applied amount, our manufacturing overhead applied, our estimate was a little too low. In the perfect world, this would have been $4,000 higher, and there would be no adjustment made down here. But the last thing we do is we make our adjustment. And in this case, it was for the $4,000, which will increase our cost of goods sold. And we get our adjusted cost of goods sold of 129,000.